This Sunday rather than the text for All Saints' Day. It comes from the 12th chapter of St. Mark, beginning at the 28th verse. One of the scribes came near and heard him disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, he asked them, "Which commandment is the first of all?" And Jesus answered, "The first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." And then the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and besides him there is no other, and to love him with all your heart and with all your understanding and with all your strength, and to love one's neighbor as yourself. This is much more important than all the whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he answered wisely, he said to them, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And after that, no one dared to ask him any questions. Here ends the gospel for the day. Please be seated. When I was in the seminary, my professor, my Old Testament professor and Hebrew professor, was a man by the name of John Victor Halverson. I think I've mentioned him before. He had a very, very distinct Norwegian accent. And one of the things that would happen when we asked him any question in class, the first thing he would ever say to anybody who asked him the question was, "That is a very good question." And then he would begin to answer the question no matter how good or bad he thought it was. But then on the last class period we had before we graduated, he came to the front of the class and he said, "You know, guys, you're going to leave and get ordained now. And when you get out in the parish, they're going to ask you some pretty dumb questions. But," he said, "what you do is always say, 'That is a very good question.'" Well, so all of us were thinking now, all the questions we asked during the year, he thought they were dumb. But then he added something. And he said, "You know, there's really no dumb question as long as it's asked in earnest. And it might seem simple to you, but it will be complex to somebody else. So please regard all questions with care." In our text today, Jesus is asked a question that at the beginning seems rather dumb. And it comes after they have been asking him dumb questions. The reason they were dumb is not that they were bad questions, but they were simply questions meant to trap him and make him unpopular with the population so that they would carry out a directive to kill him. The first question that is asked in the chapter just before this one is they come to him and ask him, "By what authority are you preaching? Who gave you the permission to preach what you're preaching?" They said in their own minds, he doesn't have any authority to preach. Jesus knew that they were just out to get him on some technicality. And he didn't even bother to ask that question. He said, he didn't say that's a dumb question. He said, "Before I answer, let me ask you a question because I know that you know the answers. And if you answer your question that I give you, then I'll answer the question you gave me." He said, "The baptism of John, was it from God or was it from men?" Well, they reason to themselves, if we say it's from God, he'll say, "Why didn't you believe in him then?" And if we say from men, the people will be upset with us because they think he's a great prophet. He's got a large following. We'll be in trouble with them. They would be in the same situation that they were trying to put Jesus. They said, we don't know. He said, well, I guess I don't have to answer your question then. We don't like Jesus in that light, being kind of a smart aleck, but sometimes that's the way he responded. The next question was, somebody came and said, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar? Because they said, if he said, yes, it is, that'll anger the scribes and the Pharisees. And if he says it's not, then we'll get him against the government and be considered a traitor, one who was designed for insurrection. And Jesus said, let me see a coin. And they gave him a coin. He said, whose picture is on this coin? And he said, well, Caesar's. Well, I guess you got to give Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what's God's. Well, they were confounded with this. But then one of the other wise people came up and they said to them, I have really got a question for you. Jewish law tells us that if a person is married and he dies, his brother, his oldest living single brother, marries his wife, his widow, so he can raise his children and that she will be protected. Now here's the deal. It's hypothetical, of course. A man dies and his next oldest brother marries his wife. And he dies. And the next oldest brother marries the woman. And okay, we go down 7 times. 7 brothers have this woman as their wife. Now in heaven, who's the one that's going to be her husband? They thought they had him. He didn't say that's really a dumb question. What he said is, in heaven, things aren't the same. People when you're married are given in marriage. Now, I know that's disappointing to some of you who are waiting to meet your spouse who's passed away. But for other people, spending eternity with their husband or wife forever is not the brightest prospect as far as eternity is concerned. So he said, well, they're not given, it's a different situation in heaven, totally different, but much better, much better. It was another way of saying that's a dumb question, but he had a wise answer to it. Okay, so now we come to the text for the day. This scribe is sitting listening to all of this going on, and he said, he's answering those questions really marvelous. The scribe really gives him a legitimate question, although it doesn't seem like a legitimate question in the first thinking about it. He asks him, of all the laws that we have in our Torah, which one is the most important? Is there an order of laws? Now, on first blush, that looks really like a dumb question, and we might call it that. Because we think, I go for a driver's test, and I look at all these laws, and I go to the person that's giving me a test on my driving exam, and I say, which of these laws do I obey? Which don't I obey? Well, he would say, oh, I'm afraid you have to obey them all, or you're in trouble. We go to a football game, or we are trained to play football or any kind of sport, and we are given the book of rules. Which rule, you say, is really the most important? Which ones don't I have to really consider as important? Well, they're all important. And when you come to the rules of God, aren't all of them equally important? Well, when we start placing importance one way or the other on the laws, they become really difficult to ascertain which is the greatest and which isn't, which is at the bottom of the heap and which is in the top. And Jesus responds, as we all know he responded. He said, "This is the law that is above all others. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." That's all a part of that great commandment. And all the rest of the commandments rise and fall on this commandment alone. The scribe says, that really is a good answer. Now the scribe knows, because the scribe's purpose was to be in charge of all the laws and give them definition to the people. They were the people who were really the law interpreters, the so-called judges of that day. And he said, certainly, that is more important. Loving God and caring for your neighbor is much more important than anything else. And all the laws do stand or fall on this. And Jesus commends them, and he says, you have answered rightly. You know the law, and you understand it. You understand that it really jives with this great commandment when you are talking about worship or not worshiping. But when you have a law that says you shall not round off the hair on your temples or mar the edges of your beard, that's not really a significant law in those 613 laws that you have to obey to be a good Jew. And so what God does is he takes these commands and he puts them in our hands, and he said, okay, you make your own moral code, but it's based on this. This filters all your decisions. This decides in your mind what is right and wrong. Is it the best possible thing you can do for your relationship with Jesus Christ? Is it the best thing you can do in terms of caring for your neighbor? And if it is, then it's okay. And if it's not, then it's not. We make our own laws. We make our own commandment list of which are the most important. We have a couple things we think are ultimately important, but we take the ones about bearing false witness and using the name of God inappropriate or not worshiping as not significant at all. We do order our laws. We say in our own mind which is the most important. But in the measurement by the standard that God gave us, they don't measure up. They are important if they show the greatest love and dedication to God and the greatest care for your neighbor. Do not cheat. Make rational, good, just decisions. Do not be partial to the poor or defer to the rich. And on from these quotes from the Old Testament, they are laws that are important because they elevate your relationship with God and show your concern for the purpose of caring for your neighbors. Most of the things that break churches apart, most of the things that break families apart are not laws of God. They are laws that we make up in our own mind and use to divide ourselves. Most of the things that break churches are not over the 10 Commandments. It is about things that we made up to make what we call an orderly church. So when we come before God today, just as the scribe did, and ask, what is the greatest commandment? He says it's a simple process. It really, don't spend too much time about asking really irrelevant questions. You've got a situation. How do you respond? By saying, is the best thing I can do to serve God in honoring this? It is the best showing of love for my neighbor. If you do that, you're home free. Amen.